Dr. John Rhodes, one of the nation's top cardiologists who has helped pioneer some of the most innovative techniques in the industry, almost didn't get into medical school when he scored a 1 on his MCAT reading. Today, he works as the operations director for the Congenital Heart Center at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. But his journey to the top has been far from easy. Since an early age, he struggled with reading and found it more difficult than the other kids his age.
I knew when I heard my mom talking to the teacher that there was some sort of problem, because that was a news flash to me that my little brother could read all the books in the house and I couldn't read any. I just thought he couldn't play sports and I could, but unfortunately it wasn't quite that way. And so I always knew that I had my own struggles, but I never really thought of myself as any different than anyone else. I did have to go to special teaching to learn how to read on the weekends when I really wanted to play football in the streets, but I would do that with my mom, and I've known for him a long time, but I've just tried to work around it rather than maybe embracing it.
With a long history of medical professionals in his family, John knew that that was a path he wanted to take. While he got through school relatively well, there were 3 letters standing in his way of going to college: SAT.
If someone tells me I need to take a test, I know there's trouble ahead. The first test was the SAT, and I did exceedingly poor on the SAT. There was a person who worked at North Carolina State. He was the registrar at North Carolina State, Mr. Bundy, and he recognized that I was smart. I just did poorly on the SAT. So he figured out a way to get me the opportunity to get accepted to North Carolina State under sort of a program where as long as I did well in the first year, I would stay there. But if I did poorly, I would have to move on, but I made good grades.
What John didn't know is that he was actually struggling with dyslexia, a learning difference that causes him to mix up letters and words. Often, he would read sentences 3 or 4 times over to make sure he read it correctly, which, as you can imagine, made studying that much more difficult.
Authors love to use words that I'm not familiar with, and often I just sit there with the phone and look up the words, or I reread sentences to make sure that I got the context of the sentence correct and understood what they were trying to tell me. But I'm just used to doing that. I don't know any other way.
In order to get into medical school, John would have to pass the MCAT exam. And as with all tests, for John, that was going to pose a problem.
Whenever I have to take a standardized test, that can be a problem. So on the MCAT, I scored a 1 on the reading section of the MCAT. I always tell people I scored a 0 because technically a 1 doesn't add a lot of points to your total score. So it's like getting 0 points to your total score. But technically, the average MCAT score is somewhere around 25, 26. Now the MCAT's has changed. It's not the same today. The way the scoring is as it was when I took it. I got 25 on the MCAT on 2 sections instead of 3. So I actually scored the national average, but I just did so poorly on the 1 section that the med schools were, appropriately afraid that maybe I wouldn't be able to do the work.
John worked with a reading specialist to help read more efficiently, which got him up to a score of 6.
But unfortunately, 6 was not the national average score, and a lot of the med schools, they have a lot of applications and a lot of really good, strong applications. So they have to come up with ways to figure out who they're going to interview and not. And with a score that was less than the national average, they chose not to interview. Brody School of Medicine really went out on a limb to help me.
But medical school proved to be one hurdle after another until one professor took notice of John.
When I had to take the USMLE, I barely passed the first one, but I passed with no help. And then You have to take the second USMLE. There's multiple tests that you have to take. I struggled with the reading on that one, and I only failed it by a bit, but I failed it. And that's when the professor that I worked with, Dr. Ector, noticed me and pointed out that he thinks I have dyslexia and other learning disabilities. And he got me tested, and he was right. So he got me extended time on the USMLE test, and I went back and finished in the top percentile nationally. So I knew it, I just couldn't read it fast enough.
Not only did John find out why he had reading difficulties all these years, but he also found his strengths.
The psychologist that tested me when I was 29 told me that I scored on the top percentile for visual spatial resolution. His point was, don't focus on the fact that you can't spell the word physician, focus on the fact that this is your strength, and you take that and go forward. So Dr. Ector and I talked about it, and I came up with going into cardiology, where I use imaging that I'm very good at.
So much so that John does something very unique when explaining conditions to his patients. Since he is a visual learner, he draws out their heart with the defect in it, explaining to them their issues and what the procedure will correct. He even signs it and then gives it to them. From 2003 to 2013, he was the chief of Duke University's Children's Heart Center, director of the Pediatric and Adult Congenital Interventional Catheterization Laboratory, and co-director of the Adult Congenital Heart Program. Ironically, Duke University was one of the schools that denied him an interview into med school. John went on to work at Nicklaus Children's Health System in Miami and eventually returned to the Medical University of South Carolina in 2017.
I don't believe that any of this is anything more than just a different way of learning. And I believe that people like me are just as smart and maybe a little more creative.
In an effort to reach other kids like himself, John has started a shadowing program for kids with learning differences so they can see firsthand that success is achievable with a little extra effort. For A World of Difference, I'm Cindy Peterson.